Okay.
I'm gonna start recording.
Let me see. Okay. Hey everyone, welcome to this next Sunday school lesson, January 14th, 2018. This was on the Restoration Edition, chapter 2 of 1st Nephi. And we are going to go through this and see how it goes. The bulk of the chapter is, of course, taken up by Lehi's dream. So we'll spend a lot of time on that. But I wanted to talk about a couple of things in addition to that. In particular, there was an unanswered question from last time asked by Taylor. And Taylor asked a question about the difference between Lehi and Nephi and many of the others who have searched for the Lord but not found him. And I mean, I of course don't have like the answer, right? But I was struck when I was reading it by this idea that Lehi went and prayed with all his heart in behalf of his people. If you search for that phrase, in behalf of, it kind of pops up in some really interesting spots. But even the word behalf is interesting. So the word behalf is from by and half. It's an old English word, with half meaning side or part / cut. Not necessarily like an equal division in two, the way we think of, two parts. That was kind of later. So it is on or by the side of, or for the sake of good of someone, or near. Going back to the sense of cut, pledges or covenants are often spoken of as cut in the Old Testament. You can think about Abraham. I think it's Abraham or Genesis 14 in our old scriptures. But there's this, he has to cut all these animals, and the divine presence walks between them, and there's all these really cool things, symbols there. Anyway, the idea is in behalf of, that you're standing in behalf of the other person. One of those, which of course is like the Savior, right? Who came down on all of our behalf, which I guess suggests, speaking of priesthood or the holy order, what it takes to kind of get to where the Lord answers you in this way. So I encourage you to kind of go out, sometime and search for that, pray in behalf of, or just the word behalf in the Book of Mormon. I think you find some really cool things. One of them that I wanted to point out was the title Liberty, which was rent or cut from Moroni's coat. This is it's a pledge or covenant, and it was on behalf of our God, our religion, our freedom, our peace, and our wives and our children. And I think that's pretty cool. Let's see. Talked about that. And, we're always kind of slow, or at least I'm slow. But Moroni in Mormon 4 kind of, to me, he sums it up where he says, those saints who have gone before me, he's quoting the Lord, who have possessed this land shall cry, yea, even from the dust will they cry unto the Lord. And as the Lord liveth, he will remember the covenant which he hath made with them. And he knoweth their prayers, that they were in behalf of their brethren. Suggesting again that there's this really powerful, there's a power there, right? Charity has a power, but there's also power in prayer on behalf of your brothers and sisters. And so I wanted to hit that before we kind of dove into the lesson today, because I got a lot of meaning out of that. That was pretty powerful for me. And also I just want to kind of mention to people, I am the lone man in the garden today. My wife's been out of town all weekend, and she doesn't get back till tonight. So there may be a kid emergency. There may not. If there is, you'll know why, and I'll at least have kind of warned you. All right. So let's jump in really quickly. I wanted to talk about some of the symbolism in Lehi's dream. And before really diving in, this is kind of a continuation of last time. So following from Bryce, he talked about the Deuteronomists, right, and that they were in control of the church and the government. We know that there were strongholds. Really that was where it all came down, was in Jerusalem, in the temple. They kind of took that over, and a few things happened that were really interesting. So I think that's something to think about. All right. Okay. So really quickly, I'm sure people already kind of know these things, but I found it helpful for me to kind of go over these again, and I wanted to talk about these. So if you're thinking the temple has three rooms, right? The ulam is the temple porch. So this is kind of this front area, and it's depicted very differently. Depending on which account you're reading, it tells you that it's very, very tall. Sometimes these pillars right here are spoken of as being inside of it, or they're outside. In other words, it may have been roofless. It may have been just this tall, this big porch, right, with tall pillars and walls. It may have been roofed. It's hard to tell. So that's one. As you go up, you go into the hekel, which that word can be used for a palace or a nave. It can also refer to the entire building as a whole, like in Isaiah 6, or even like an upper room. It's kind of that similar. So they have this big room, or this big building. And then the final one, the Debir, which is the Holy of Holies, also called the oracle or the inner house. It's interesting that the Hebrew root comes from word or speech, which is devar. So Debir is the place of speaking, is one way it's referred to. It's separated from the hekel looks like by both a door and a veil. Again, we know that there's an altar of incense right here, and there was this sea where people would get baptized or get washed or cleansed on their way into the temple. And all these things will kind of come back to us as we're reading Lehi's dream. And I kind of skipped over his dream, just like reading it, where maybe we would have done that if we had more time. But I figured this is the lesson that everyone knows. Everyone who sat through a Book of Mormon lesson has had this vision talked about several times. So I kind of assumed we all kind of knew the basics. I wanted to go and see how Lehi was viewing it, because I tend to read this divorced from Lehi's context. And I found that when I dove into the temple symbolism that Lehi would have been very familiar with, having lived in Jerusalem all of his life, as we're told, that a lot of interesting things came out that were different than Nephi's. And I won't compare and contrast them because that's a different lesson, but hopefully that will pop out. Okay, so there are some what I'm calling temple mysteries when you're reading of a vision in the Old Testament of the temple. There are several things that tend to be there. So first is the presence of the Lord. You tend to see God sitting enthroned or resting upon a throne or a seat or upon the Ark of the Covenant. Again, that was all in the Debir. The Ark of the Covenant was there. The second, which is a little bit more, you don't see it quite as much, but the connection, I'm sure, is obvious, is the rod of iron. Psalms 1 and 2, which I've heard or seen or read, that really should be just one text. It starts off with a fruitful tree beside a river of water, and there the king's enemies are shattered with a rod of iron. I'm sure that symbolism is not lost on you. If those things are all together, that's really interesting. Psalm 23 is kind of where the rod becomes an instrument of comfort, and we'll kind of come back to that. But it's this iron rod or this staff. It becomes in Psalm 23 it's interesting because it's next to still waters in that spot. Isaiah 11:1, again, the rod is a figure to prophesy about. And I don't have this is kind of me, but I'm not sure how to see what comments are coming in. So I'm just going to wait and keep going unless my moderator stops me or someone else jumps in.
Yeah.
But should we stop right there? Questions or thoughts? Okay, cool. All right, you've got me. The other thing that we tend to see a lot in these visions are rivers or a river. Daniel 7, you have a fiery stream coming out of the throne on which the Ancient of Days sits. And 1 Enoch 4, the rivers of flaming fire. It might be 1 Enoch 14. I want to check that. Anyway, the rivers of flaming fire coming from the throne of God in which the great glory sits, which gown is the word, whiter than any snow. And I thought that the whiter than any snow is particularly interesting when you're thinking about things to come later on. There's the river flowing out of Eden that gives life to everything out there. Revelation 22, you have God's throne emitting a pure river of water and life. And Christ identifies himself with this living water. See Zechariah 14:8 for what he's quoting. But this is his last, it's like his last day, his last week in the temple. He says, from my belly will flow forth living waters. And that's good to read in John and in the testimony of John. Okay, really quickly, we mentioned Enoch 14, this temple vision. There are kind of three parts to this that I think are interesting. The first of which is, let's see, sorry. And if you, I don't know if you, most people haven't read Enoch. It's very visionary, and so for me, a lot of it goes over my head. But reading it this time, there are some things that stuck out, and I think as you read, they might suggest something to you as well. Part 1, this is the beginning. Behold, in the vision, clouds invited me, and a mist summoned me. And the course of the stars and the lightning sped and hastened me, and the winds in the vision caused me to fly and lifted me upward and bore me into heaven. And I went in. There are several things here that are interesting, but the doesn't seem to be a roof or a ceiling on this one, right? But he goes in, and it's almost like he goes into this great porch or this great courtyard or something, right? Part 2, he said, and I went into the tongues of fire and drew nigh to a large house, which was built of hailstones, and the walls of the house were like stone slabs, and they were all of snow, and the floor was of snow, or crystal, depending on what translation you're reading. Its ceiling was like the path of the stars and the lightnings, and between them were fiery cherubim, and their heaven was water. So you have this large house, you have a ceiling, you have water. Part 3, and I beheld a vision, and lo, there was a second house, greater than the former, and the entire portal stood open before me, and it was built of flames of fire. And I looked and saw a lofty throne. Its appearance was as crystal, and the wheels thereof as the shining sun. And there was a vision of cherubim. And from underneath the throne came streams of flaming fire, so that I could not look thereon. And the great glory sat thereon, and his raiment shone more brightly than the sun, and was whiter than any snow. So this, I kind of wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about Enoch's vision, his temple vision, because at the very beginning of the Book of Mormon, Lehi has this vision where he sees 12, he sees 1 and then 12 with him coming down, and they're brighter than the sun. We also have in this vision that he's about to share with us talk of fruit being whiter than the snow, or whiter than any whiteness that he had seen. And so I share this because I don't think Joseph could have just kind of come up with this out of nowhere. It seems to match the pattern of visions we see in Scripture, which are strengthened by Enoch and some of these other more recent things that we've discovered. All right, let's see. Okay, so let's start going to the dream. Of course, it starts out, and you have something fun. Okay, so there's this man in white. Lehi says, I saw a man, sorry, there's a typo, and he was dressed in a white robe. He spake unto me and bade me follow him. I never thought that was weird until recently when I started realizing that a man shouldn't ask you to follow him. We only follow one person or one group of people, and they are not mortal. So Lehi has this man comes and tells him to follow him. He does, and so there are several connections that I think suggest this man in white was a temple guy, either the high priest or one of the priests. So in Leviticus 16, we read, he shall put on the holy linen tunic. This holy linen tunic was made out of white flax. And so they were called by Christian scholars, people who study this, the white garments. Ordinary priests wore the same thing. And another example is the Levites being arrayed in white linen stood at the east end of the altar. 2 Chronicles 5. So there's this man in white who very well could have been, at least to Lehi, maybe this is the high priest or someone dressed like a priest comes to him and says, hey, come follow me. And Lehi, being the awakened Jew or the recently awakening Jew, says, okay, I'll do that, right? He follows him, he gets lost, he cries out to the Lord, and he uses some interesting words right here. So remember, ulam is that word that we had talked about before, right? That's part 1 of the temple. So Lehi says, after I prayed unto the Lord, I beheld a large and spacious field, as if it had been a world, which is kind of a weird thing to say, right? I mean, he did say it was a large and spacious field, but did he need to bring in this as if it had been a world? And of note, we remember that Lehi was taught in the learning of the Jews, and Nephi was as well. But it seems like Lehi wrote in Egyptian, and that Nephi did as well. So what's interesting to me is this is Lehi's account, or Nephi's account of Lehi speaking the dream. So it's not Lehi's written account, because that would have been different. I think Lehi's written account would have read differently. Maybe he would have used Egyptian symbols. I don't know those very well. I don't know Hebrew well either. I don't know any of it. But this is really interesting. I think you'll like it. Again, so this, this field it's step 1 of a temple vision journey. Large and spacious field, that could fit this description of a roofless porch. Now, where I think it gets interesting is to look at the Hebrew word for world, olam, which is again just one letter off from ulam, which kind of reads like a pun on the name of the temple porch. So the two words would have been pronounced the same. World implied. So it's very interesting that when it says the world as in like a physical world, the King James Version doesn't use that word, but the God of the world is sometimes that Hebrew word is olam, and so there's this idea that world here implies both a vast time and space, and I've got some more notes. We'll share this with you guys later, in case you kind of want to dig into that. And if you don't worry about it. Anyway, so what was interesting to me looking at this is if the Hebrew word for olam, world, if that's what he was going for, as if it had been a world, then there's this pun, right? He's kind of punning on the name of the porch. And so you've got two symbols right away in the very first line, where he sees a man, he's told to follow him, and then he prays and beholds this large and spacious field as if it were a world. So going on, it's like, well, we saw maybe a couple of temple symbols. Do we see more? The second room is the Hekel. And so Lehi says, on the other side of the river of water, a great and spacious building. And it stood, as it were, in the air, high above the earth. And it was filled with people, and their manner of dress was exceeding fine, and they were in the attitude of mocking and pointing their fingers. So the temple as a whole is a hekel. The main middle room is the hekel, and a palace or a great big building could be called a hekel. So there's some space to say that maybe this idea of this great and spacious building is this temple, right? This temple that would have been Jerusalem, the center of all of their worship. If you can kind of picture where it lies, this obstacle is right beside the iron rod, midway, along this 3-station journey. And it is appropriately described, in my opinion, as high above the earth, just like a mountain or heaven, right? We talked about Enoch had to fly up there. Isaiah 6:1, the temple is high and lifted up, according to Isaiah. And there's quotes in Daniel and Ezekiel of kind of the exact same thing. But these people are taken up high, which is, kind of, to me, another symbol that was talking about the temple. Fine is kind of the KJV's par excellence for an adjective for things made for use in the temple. You have Aaron's ephod, the coat and mitre are being made of fine linen, as are his sons' coats, their bonnets, breeches, and the girdle. So these are the priests and the high priest's clothes. They're all described as fine. I think in Exodus, I think you have 30 instances of the word fine, and they all refer to something in the temple. So again, something there, and I want to get back to this hekel. So Bryce or someone remind me if I don't come back to this, because I'm going to skip what they were doing, right? They were in the attitude of mocking and pointing their fingers. But I think that's one of the keys of this whole thing. Okay, so assuming people are still with me, so diving in further to Lehi's dream and Solomon's temple. So Lehi beholds this river of water, which runs along, and it was near the tree. And he also beheld a straight and narrow path, and it led by the head of the fountain into a large and spacious field. And many were drowned in the depths of the fountain. So we have Nephi telling us later on what it means. But even with Lehi's words, that's very interesting. That many were drowned in the depths of the fountain. When you think about the brazen sea, this bronze thing right here. When we think of baptism, we think about full immersion. And I know that was practiced back then as well. But with us, you are trusting, right? When you go under the water, you're trusting whoever that guy is that's holding you down, that they will bring you back up. And there's some beautiful symbols there of Christ, who we trusted. We went down and died. We were removed from where we were before, took on these bodies, these mortal bodies, and we're trusting that someone else is going to pull us back up. So it's interesting that these waters did not do that, right? If you're thinking about the waters a little bit more, I was struck by the fact that Lehi's family was found at the head of the fountain. And I don't know if this makes sense to anyone else, but to me, I was struck by the fact that could be Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem is the head of the fountain. They were the head of the waters are supposed to run from Jerusalem and give life to all the world. At least if you read Ezekiel and some of these other discussions, but here they don't, because the waters at Jerusalem were polluted because they came from the head thereof, which was sick. And I think we'll point to Isaiah 1, but this comes up there a lot as well. And you also have some myths, right? One of the first things he sees, along with the river water, was a mist of darkness. He says, there arose a mist of darkness, yea, even exceeding great mist of darkness, insomuch that they who had commenced in the path did lose their way. So if you're looking at my little image, right, you have incense was burning all the time. Burning incense daily was originally the high priest's task. So it is interesting how now in this vision he's seeing this temple, and instead of the altar of incense making incense that everyone that would kind of that God would shine down on and look at people, or maybe it would be a pillar of smoke that would suggest that God was protecting them, it's a great mist of darkness, so that anyone who starts on the path gets lost. And so, there's the Isaiah one. So it's interesting how the priest's daily work could lead people astray. And I wanted to read, I'm in Isaiah 1, something that I think suggests this might be the case, that this is talking about like a temple thing. So I'm in my old scriptures, because the Old Testament's not done yet. Either way, it'd be Isaiah 1. But he says, this is verse 11, "To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices unto me, saith the Lord? I am full of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I delight not in the blood of the bullocks or of lambs or of he-goats. When you come to me, you appear before me. Who has required this at your hands, to tread my courts? Bring no more vain oblations. Incense is an abomination unto me. New moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with." Another word is endure. I cannot endure with it. "It is iniquity, even the solemn meeting. When you spread forth your hands, I will hide mine eyes from you. Yea, when you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood." So there's this idea that these sacrifices and this incense, which they thought was bringing God down, was not, and it actually caused people to get lost, to lose their way towards the tree, whatever that tree is, and towards the fruit, which hierarchical religion can do if we put our faith in the ordinance rather than, or the religion, I guess, rather than what those things point to. Okay, so going with some more symbols, the rod of iron. Lehi sees a rod of iron extending along the bank of the river, and it led to the tree by which I stood, and it also led by the head of the fountain. So so there's this rod of iron, goes out, and he's looking at it because he's already partaken of the fruit. He's looking at it where it leads, and it goes all the way back. It goes along the river, by the building, it goes all the way by the head of the fountain, which to me suggests, if you think about the connection between Laban, his high connections with the elders of the Jews, the records were at the fountain, right? They were in Jerusalem. That was where you'd find the word. And so they led by it, right? They were close. That's where you'd start the path, is by the head of the fountain. You just had to get on the right path rather than the wrong one. He says, "Yea," and this is in Psalm 23. We talked about this before, but Psalm 1 and 2 and Psalm 23, there's this idea of a rod or staff used for good, right? And I think that, especially considering the mist of darkness we just looked about, Psalm 23 can have a slightly different meaning than it normally does. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Hold on, sorry. Hey, buddy. "I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." So maybe to Lehi, this was done on purpose, right? Maybe this was part of the way he's telling it, that it would maybe evoke this idea of this dark valley, right, where everyone's lost, and that the rod would comfort you. Okay, so now looking through to the Debir. This is the Holy of Holies. This is where the Ark of the Covenant is, and maybe some other things too, but we'll get to that soon. Lehi says, "I did say unto them with a loud voice." Like, that's kind of I don't know. Like, does that matter? I don't know. But it's interesting that the Debir is known as a place of speaking. And Ezekiel out of the temple hears a voice of one that spake. I don't know. It just seems like one of those details in Lehi's story that means more than I've ever thought it was or could have. And this was kind of something that came to me as maybe what it could mean. So Lehi also beheld a straight and narrow path which came along by the iron rod, even to the tree by which I stood. So just as the priest had to pass through the veil to reach the Debir, so also they had to go along the path by the rod of iron, even to the tree. And so there's this idea that you have to pass through It's a straight and narrow path in Lehi's vision, but for but in the other ones, it's not like that, right? With Solomon's temple, you have to pass through this veil, which, there's, again, if there's a door and a veil, maybe the mists of darkness are the veil, and the door, is the straight and narrow path, which most people can't quite open, can't quite make it through. Back to the heckle, and this is kind of debated about where this candlestick is. I think more and more people are thinking that it used to be in the, it was actually in the Debir rather than the heckle, but either way, this is a pretty cool description. I think it's found in Exodus. So let's talk about the candlestick, right? It says, "Thou shalt make a candlestick of pure gold. Of beaten work shall the candlestick be made. His shaft and his branches, his bowls, his knops, and his flowers shall all be of the same. And the 6 branches shall come out of the sides of it. 3 branches of the candlestick out of the one side, and 3 branches of the candlestick out of the other. 3 bowls made like unto almonds, with a knop and a flower in one branch. And 3 bowls made of almonds, their knops and their branches shall be all of the same. All it shall be one beaten work of pure gold. And thou shalt make the 7 lamps thereof, and they shall light the lamps thereof, that they may give light over against it." This lamp is, when you read it like that, especially with some of the highlighted words, reminds you of a tree, right? There are branches and knops and flowers. There are bowls like almonds. This also kind of reminds you of Aaron's his rod or his staff, which blossomed in 3 different ways, and there were flowers and almonds and buds, which is kind of cool too. There's a lot here that I think is powerful, but one thing that struck me just when I was preparing it for just now was this idea that it shall all be one beaten work of pure gold. Everyone knows that we've kind of gone through a beating with the Guidance Standard, and some of these, the recent things that we've had to do as a group. And I think that it has been for good, because in many ways, people have been beaten to be together, right? Because it's all supposed to be of the same. Everything's supposed to be of the same substance, pure gold, and all to be one, that it may give light. Again, thinking about the fruit, which is white, above all that's white. So there's, I don't have time to go into it. Is there a question or thought?
Jeff, yeah. This is Bryce. Just a thought. Isn't it interesting that the parable of the 10 virgins has to do with lighting something that has oil in it? I mean, is there a connection here between the ability to produce light and the woman and wisdom?
I think so. It's interesting. I mentioned that wisdom had been removed from the temple, right? Because the tree was not found there. But I think it's connected to a lot of things. I think that parable is really powerful in that you have virgins and not men lighting it, and that I didn't want to get into this much because this is kind of Nephi's side, but Nephi describes the tree as being beautiful above all that's beautiful, and he then describes the virgin as being of most fair and beautiful virgin. So I think so, and I know we're going to learn more about wisdom and things this March, and I'm excited about it. But I think so. I don't know. That's my kind of rambling answer, but yes.
Jeff, it was asked, can you, that thing that says go to meeting sharing, can you minimize that, or is that just part of your screen? You can hit hide.
There we go.
Yeah.
Yes. Hide. Awesome. So yes. Any other questions before? We've kind of been going fast, but.
No, this is great. Anybody else have any questions? You can put it into the chat. I'll unmute you. I'm happy to. All right.
Okay, good. I was hoping that this would be like an intro and that we could publish the PowerPoint. People could kind of go through this on their own. All right, so that's very interesting, and we'll get into that some more. Another thing that's really interesting, and again, I'm trying to just focus on Lehi's vision rather than Nephi's, because to me, they have very different contexts and implications. So the Debir, again, and it's under debate where the bread or the shewbread, the showbread, or where the presence or the manna was. Most, I think, biblical scholars would say it was in Hekel, but I think it may have been somewhere else. Either way, and it's not just me. I think the more Mormon scholars you go to, and I haven't read a whole lot of Margaret Barker, but I think this is part of her thinking, is it was actually part of the Debir. So let's talk about that. Lehi says, the fruit is most sweet above all that I had ever before tasted, and was white to exceed all the whiteness that I'd ever seen. Now, we have sugar, and sugar is everywhere, right? We can just down sugar like nothing. You can find it in all different ways. But I don't know, like in the ancient world, was honey like their main source? I mean, I don't know if they had sugar cane. I don't know where they got that from. That's more of a tropical thing. Anyway, it's interesting that manna is similarly white. It's like it's described in the Bible. It says it was like coriander seed white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So there's a connection there. Christ describes himself in John. He says, "My Father is offering true life-giving bread from heaven, which is light and truth. For the bread of God is sent from the heavenly council to give light and truth to the world." This is from the Testimony of John that Denver released recently. But it's also in John 7 that you'll find that same quote. I think 7 and 8. But it's interesting that it's, life-giving bread from heaven, which is tying it to manna, tying it to these other things. The next bullet point is really interesting to me too. This bread of the presence of the showbread. If you read through Leviticus 24, you'll see there's much more details, but there are 12 pieces. Aaron and his sons were to eat it in the holy place, which to me suggests the Debir. Maybe not, maybe the Hekel. It's seasoned by frankincense, and it's quote-unquote eaten as a memorial. Isn't that fascinating? It's just fascinating to me that this white sweet bread was eaten that way. It reminds me of Luke 22, an upper room, right? The word Hekel could be described as it could also be a great spacious room. There were 12 men who partake of the bread in remembrance of him. And so there's kind of a link there. Revelation 22, and he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding out of the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the midst of the street of it, and on either side of the river, was there the tree of life, which bare 12 fruits, and yielded her fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So again, you have you have a river of water. This one's pure, proceeding out of the throne of God. In the midst of the street of it, on either side of the river, was the tree of life with 12 fruits. You have the 12 breads. When we're thinking of what is Lehi seeing, what is Lehi tying this vision to, it seems very likely that he could be tying the fruit of the tree to this bread of the presence, the showbread, or the manna, which is kind of the same bread. And I think that tie comes out at the very end of Lehi's little discussion, where he says, Laman partook not of the fruit. And then it says that Lehi, this is Nephi describing what his dad says, right? He exceedingly feared for them, yet he feared they should be cast off from the presence of the Lord. So they partook not of the fruit, which is symbolic of the presence of the Lord. And so that's why he feared that they would be cast out from his presence, because they were not eating the bread of the presence. They weren't eating the manna. They weren't partaking of this fruit, which represents Christ, which is represented by a lot of cool Jewish symbols. And if you want some more reading, Alma 19 talks about how the Adam and Eve being cut off from the tree of life is to be cut off temporally and spiritually from the presence of the Lord. And it's funny because if you go to Nephi's vision, he talks about being cut off temporally and spiritually from the presence of the Lord as well, which means that Alma, I think, was quoting Nephi. And so again, so kind of in summary, I've given a lot of random, seemingly random parts, but every piece that you look at, you can see how, I hope maybe you're persuaded that one way to view this is Lehi is seeing this vision and he's tying it to the religion of his day. He's tying it to the temple, he's tying it to the high priest, he's tying it to, to incense and Heko and the Debir. And all these things they're not what they should be, right? The tree and the fruit and the bread are not where he expected them to be. They were not there. So that I think that there's some really cool stuff there to think about. Maybe it's not life-changing, maybe it is. To me, when I first discovered it, it was life-changing because I was discovering that Isaiah 1 was talking about us. That we were not, maybe all of our work for the dead was exactly the same as someone else's work, as the Jews' work, right? Or the Israelites' work. And the Lord was kind of tired of it because we didn't know what we were doing. And I've since come to realize more and more how little I actually knew about the mission of Elijah and things. Okay, so I said I would go back to the Heko. And this, I want to get back to this later on in a different lesson sometime. But Alma 19 makes the link between the tree of life and the presence of the Lord. And I think if you are persuaded by any of this, then you'll realize that this presence of the Lord is represented by the fruit of the tree. So let's talk about those that were pointing the finger of scorn, right? These are people who were in the temple, maybe temple goers. Notice the background of the slide. And they were pointing the finger of scorn at those who are partaking of the fruit. What they were doing, and we don't really have what they said, but we know from Nephi that they are the house of Israel. So Lehi describes the people in the building as the house of Israel.
Hey, Jeff.
And they were judging.
We have a great comment from the Zings, and it's
oh, awesome.
Maybe mock means copying patterns of heaven.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
You want me to? No, I can unmute the. That's a really fascinating comment. Do you guys have any more thoughts on that? It reminds me of what Emma Smith talked about concerning Brigham Young. She said that Brigham had made bogus the church, which in 1840 bogus meant copycat or imitation. Anyone else have a thought on that? That's fascinating. Doug, I'm going to unmute you. Just 1 second. If I can find you. Oh, you're already unmuted. You just need to unmute yourself if you want to comment.
Okay. Yeah, I was actually thinking about this the other day where Moroni is afraid the Gentiles would mock at these things. And I had looked at that as being laughing, but the Gentiles being the LDS doesn't quite make sense. And if you look in the 1828 dictionary, mock is to mimic in a contemptuous or derisive way. So I think that Moroni was concerned the Gentiles would make a mock as in imitating in a derisive fashion or a false fashion the things he was presenting, and I think that fits in here.
Well, it kind of goes into the concern that the Lord had when Joseph lost the 116 pages. and was commanded not to retranslate it for fear that it was going to get changed and imitated.
Yeah.
The Zangs, there was another
right. No, it's really cool, and it's interesting. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I was just going to say the Zangs had another comment, and it said the pointing the finger means Aaronic condemnation.
Yeah. No, I could totally see that. I mean, they had not only, at least for Lehi, not only mocked them, but they had also, judged them as being, worthy of death. So there's some really cool stuff, and the Mackeys and others we've talked about it, but it's interesting to me that those who were willing to criticize and to mock others' religion were not able to be there, and that if you even kind of paid attention to others mocking or others criticizing or mimicking, right, depending on where you want to go with it, you couldn't get there. And so I think it's powerful to think about what it would take to get back to the tree of life, right? If we're not there, what would it take to get there? And it seems like maybe above all things, according to this vision, it would be, being unwilling to mock or to judge or to criticize others. And it's hard to do, especially when we're learning truths about where we came from, right? The religion we came from. It's hard to not do that. But I think it's a powerful thing that if we can learn to do, we can start to partake of that fruit, which is sweet above all that's sweet and white above all that's white. It's desirable to make one happy. That's most of my lesson. I had a couple other little random thoughts, but I don't know if anyone has anything else to say, or we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left.
That's something I'd like to say.
Yeah.
I was thinking when you were sharing about how the rod guided the people through the mists of darkness, and how you said there was incense burning in the temple. It reminded me of how, because of the corrupt institution of their day, the rod, which could be the word of God, which could be the Spirit speaking to us, can comfort us and guide us to truth through all the half-truths and lies and the corruption from the hierarchy of our day.
Definitely.
One of the thoughts that I had, Jeff, was that in this dream, in this vision, you have two different stories, and the stories are playing out parallel to each other in the beginning of the Book of Mormon. The first story is Lehi, and he is following a man into darkness, and then he prays, and I just see myself reading First Nephi, where he says he prays and then he sees a pillar of fire and he's at the tree of life. That's one of the storylines that's getting played out. The second storyline is Nephi, and Nephi is looking to his father, and then he's holding on to the rod of iron. We can understand what the rod of iron is by looking at Nephi over the first 10 chapters in the old LDS version of the Book of Mormon, or the first 3 chapters of the Restoration Edition, which the rod of iron included Nephi going and praying and getting comforted that what his father was saying is true, being obedient to the Lord, going and getting the brass plates, a series of things that he was holding on to as he progressed towards his ultimate destination of the tree of life. It's just fascinating that we get to be able to see both storylines played out in Lehi's vision. Taylor Ward had a comment a couple minutes ago. He said, "We typically think mock in a deliberate condescending imitation, But it may be that Gentiles were mocking and imitating, but doing so in a way that they presumed was righteous. Based on the patterns of heaven, it's mockery. It's interesting thinking on Taylor's comment. How much do we really know what heaven is actually about? There are so few who have direct interaction with heaven that I think that we take what we think heaven is all about potentially too far. Another great comment by the Zangs. If Lehi is in the tabernacle eating the bread of life, everyone is there just doing vain ordinances while he gets it. And then Doug has a good comment. All we know is the traditions of men.
Hey, sorry, I had to jump off because my...
One more comment by the Zangs. They are mocking God and using ordinances for judgment. Anyone else have a comment? Jeff's audio cut out. All right, well, thanks everybody for joining us. There's one more comment by Taylor Ward. Vain ordinances altered ordinances that people think are godly, but their attitude is all wrong. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this Sunday school. If you have any other questions, feel free to type them in now. Next week, we're going to be going into Nephi's vision, and we'll send you an update in the middle of the week with details about that lesson. But appreciate it.